Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources today. It's a collection of personal reflections, basically diary entries, all focused around the date November 20th, but across a bunch of different years.
And right away, the sources throw down a challenge. They say you can't just let life wash over you.
Yeah, that line really stood out.
It's this insistence on finding what they call an access point. The idea is that if a conversation is too easy, if it doesn't require any real thought or curiosity, we just end up
Repeating the same old arguments over and over.
Exactly. You have to be willing to look under the hood.
So let's make that concrete. The sources bring up the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, which is, an incredibly polarizing event. Instead of just rehashing the main political points, the advice here is to find a totally different angle, a tiny window in.
Yeah.
That access point.
And it shifts the whole conversation. You're no longer talking about ideology. You're talking about, human reality. You start asking about his father or his mother.
His schooling, his grandparents.
Yeah, or even the psychological makeup of the judge or the jury. It's in those details, those peripheral facts, that you find the real insight. It's not in the headline.
It feels like a way to fight against, intellectual laziness. But there's this huge force pushing back against that kind of curiosity.
Yes.
Because right after this call for investigation, the sources just drop this blunt truth bomb. It just says, we work for the news.
And that's not a new idea, but the way it works now is completely different. A Czech philosopher, Willem Flusser, was writing about this back in the 90s.
His philosophy of photography, right?
That's the one. And then the poet Kenneth Goldsmith picked it up, saying, we all work for the camera, we're just constantly feeding it.
But back in the 90s, that was still mostly professionals, news crews, maybe some amateur photographers.
But think about now, just fast forward to today. Every single one of us has a high-definition studio and a global broadcast network right in our pocket.
We are constantly, almost reflexively, feeding the system. Pictures, reactions, hot takes, content.
We've gone from being consumers of media to being the literal fuel for the media engine. It's a huge shift. And you can see how the late 90s really set the stage for all of this.
It was the beginning of that hyperconnectivity we're all living in now.
And if you ask why this system needs to be fed constantly, the answer is, it's not very romantic. It's just capitalism.
Okay, so break down those mechanics.
Where?
Why is constant conflict more profitable than, say, calm reflection?
Because the whole system runs on capturing your attention. And one of the most efficient ways to grab attention is to make people afraid or outraged.
Fear creates interest.
Right. Fear creates interest. Interest gets eyeballs. Eyeballs create space for ads, and ads generate revenue. The logic is simple and, honestly, brutally effective.
So we might be acting in more extreme ways, both online and off, without even realizing it. Just to keep that capitalist engine going, we create the drama that then makes us outraged.
It's a perfect feedback loop. A really insidious one. If news wasn't designed as a profit-making machine that has to constantly churn, a lot of this conflict would probably just fade away.
We're the fuel.
Oh.
Unwitting, emotionally invested fuel.
Yeah.
And all that churn, that exhaustion, it leads right into another really strange trend these diary entries point out. People getting genuinely deeply offended by facts, by verifiable knowledge.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? I mean, the sources suggest this anti-fact thing might have roots back in the 60s, but that it really started gaining momentum around the turn of the millennium? Maybe something to do with the Bush administration's political climate.
But it's really exploded in the last, 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. It's become a dominant cultural force, this deliberate opposition to things we know are true.
And to explain this, to make it make sense, the sources use this brilliant metaphor from music theory.
It's such a good example because everyone thinks of music as this totally free, subjective art form, play whatever you want.
Yeah, they mentioned Miles Davis in his idea of butter notes, that there are no wrong notes. Any mistake can be fixed.
And that's true from an artistic standpoint. But on a technical level, musicians know there are rules. There is a right and a wrong way to use a note if you want a certain emotional result, and that's where the conflict comes in.
So what's the technical term they use?
It's an Italian word, appoggiatura. It literally translates to lean. It describes the physics of sound, the gravitational facts of how notes resolve.
Gravitational fact.
Yeah.
In music.
Yeah, and it's something everyone hears, even if you don't know the theory. A raised note, a sharp, has a kind of energy that pulls it upwards, and a flattened note wants to go down. Think about a suspension in a chord. That feeling when the fourth resolves down to the third. Everyone feels that release of tension.
So if I play, say, a G sharp and a D,
Yeah.
that G sharp is going to feel like it wants to rise up to an A. That's a fact of our musical language.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That is the fact. The resolution sounds right to our ears. But the problem we see today is when someone knows that, hears it, feels it, but then intentionally says, no, I'm going to force that G sharp to go down just because I don't want your fact to be correct.
It's being oppositional for its own sake, basically giving the finger to knowledge.
Yeah. And you see this in other areas, too. The sources touch on things like songwriting credits. Does the bass player who wrote a simple but essential bass line get a credit?
Ah, that's a great parallel. It's the battle between an objective contribution, a fact, and this subjective feeling of ownership.
Exactly. When the fact is inconvenient, whether it's political, scientific, or just who wrote a hit song, sometimes the human response is just defiance, pure, willful opposition.
And that deep emotional investment in a belief, whether it's defying a fact or sticking to an ideology, that brings us to the next thread in these entries, how different generations process trauma.
Right. They look at the upcoming 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and they introduce this chilling idea of the trauma thread.
And there's a family story in there, isn't there? About how the author's mother was so devastated by the assassination in '63 that it might have been a domino that led to later mental health struggles.
Yes, a life-changing inflection point. But the real insight of the trauma thread is that the 1963 event might not have been the actual starting point.
What do you mean?
It could have just been the trigger for a pain that was already there, rooted in something that happened to the family 20, 30, even 100 years before. The new trauma just activates an old, unresolved wound.
So we're talking about intergenerational trauma, where a family system kind of holds on to a blueprint for how to react to disaster.
Exactly. And that's why these big anniversaries matter so much. They aren't just dates on a calendar. They're moments where society is forced to re-examine these foundational traumas.
For my generation, it was 9/11. That was our Kennedy moment. We all know where we were.
Of course.
But for younger people today, 9/11 is just history. They know it through our trauma, through the stress and the fear that got passed down.
And that passing down of intense, unresolved emotion, it connects directly to the psychology of being deeply invested in something like a cult or a large-scale conspiracy theory.
Ah, the idea of sunk costs. But for your beliefs, for your identity.
Precisely. If you've spent years of your life, all your money, your friends, your entire identity on an idea that never comes true, how long can you keep investing?
It's almost impossible to admit that it was all for nothing. That would mean dismantling your entire world.
The breaking point is so hard to predict. When does that little seed of doubt finally become powerful enough to overwhelm all those sunk beliefs?
It's harder than quitting a bad habit. You're admitting that the last decade of your life, your intellectual life, was a waste. That's a huge loss to face.
And that's where the sources offer a bit of hope, using this universal metaphor of a pendulum or of the seasons.
You can't force the pendulum to swing back early. It has to go all the way to its extreme edge.
It's terminus, and only then can it start moving back in the other direction. It's physics.
It reminds me of that fourth turning idea, the sense that you have to just get through the winter because you know spring is eventually coming.
That's it. All this entrenched oppositional thinking we see everywhere, you could argue that's the winter. The hope isn't for some sudden miracle. It's for seeing those first buds.
The first tiny signs that the energy is shifting, that people are finally tired enough of the fighting to start looking for those little access points again.
So what does this all mean? We've followed this thread from the simple need for curiosity all the way to realizing we're basically content creators for a system that monetizes our own fear.
And that system has helped create this deep resistance to facts themselves, which we then defend because we're so emotionally and ideologically invested. It all ties back to generational trauma and the incredible weight of our own sunk costs.
The whole deep dive really shows how hard it is to find any clarity when the whole information system is designed for conflict. So if we accept that we're in this cultural winter, and we know we're constantly feeding the machine that keeps it cold, how do we even spot those first buds of spring?
What signal could possibly cut through all that noise? It's probably not going to be a big headline. It'll be something small, a detail. So the final question for you is this. If you're going to find one small access point today, that one detail you've been scrolling past, where will you start to dig? Because that choice right there is the beginning of the shift.